So we are level 84 and we just hit Empowered Monoliths. This is our attempt at taking a Void Knight and instead of being a melee character, being a spellcaster. So there's only so many spells that you get access to as a Void Knight. We are a Sentinel by default, so we get access to these couple things, but we're not really using any of them, like Lunge for movement, but we also get access to Smite, which we are making use of. I'll talk about that a little bit. And then our primary sources of damage come from Abyssal Echoes and Devouring Orb. So there's not really much else that you could do if you wanted to be a quote-unquote spellcaster. So if you want to come up with the same build, you'd probably come up with something similar to this. The one thing that will separate this build from other builds that I've seen for Void Mages or Void Knights or Purple Spell Mages, whatever you want to call it, is we're not scaling crit. So despite the fact that we are a Void Knight, and Void Knights have this awesome node right here, which gives you 60, 70, or 80 crit multi for free, we're not using it. So we have like no crit chance, no crit multi, nothing like that in our build. So let's give a quick rundown of what the build maybe like looks like first. Before I jump into a monolith and do an echo, I just want to show you like what buttons I'm holding down and what our damage looks like visually speaking. So as I'm walking around a echo, I'm holding down Q all the time, and Q is Devouring Orb. So even though it's not instant cast, it has about a 4-second cooldown on it, and I just hold it down like this. It's been smooth sailing, calm seas the entire time, and this is what I kind of look like holding down Q as I walk through an echo. Periodically, I'll also be clicking another button. So Abyssal Echoes puts a debuff on the enemy, and then if we hit the enemy, the debuff is consumed and a bunch of damage happens immediately. So normally, Abyssal Echoes, the debuff from this is called Abyssal Decay. The decay lasts for 6 seconds. We have some extra duration to make that a little bit longer, but we can take all of that 6-second damage over time, compress it into one hit, and hit them like that. So that we're scaling damage over time, but it happens very quickly. So doesn't really play like a damage over time build would normally. So this looks like this. We go pop. So we 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then you saw that my initial cast was also echoed by my Void Knight echo over there. We have about a 30% chance, 35% chance for anything to be echoed at any point in time. Even though it has a big mana cost on it, and even though this has a pretty sizable mana cost as well, the upside is that, first of all, we don't need to cast them very often. Devouring Orb has a lot of mana efficiency on it, and then Abyssal Echo lasts for, 15 seconds or something, because there's space between each of the echoes, and the echoes happen 5 or 6 times, right? In addition to that, we also have Smite, which helps with our single target damage, because there's a lot of damage baked in Smite, and it also gives us mana gained on Smite use. We're getting that from 2 places. So in Sentinel, in the base tree, we have 10 mana gain on Smite use, and then for my gear as well, we also have 6 mana gain on Smite use. Smite costs 0 mana, which is enabled by one key thing. We have to use a weapon that has the implicit of -3 spell mana cost. If we didn't use this, if we didn't have a flat minus mana cost somewhere in our gear, this build would not function. As long as we get -3, we can use the Oracle Staff. There's a staff that gives more adaptive spell damage. Remember, Oracle Staff only goes from 81 to 100. You can see that in the Oracle text up there. There's one that goes up to 120, but it does not have the -3 on it, so we cannot use that staff instead. Let's go through the passives, the masteries real quick. So we have 26 points in Sentinel. I think I like what's going on here. I'm pretty into it. So we have 8, 8, 5, and 5. So this is just like strength, resistance, vitality. We have a lot of vitality in our build. The reason that I prioritize having vitality, we're at 36 right now, is that Smite does have a life cost on it because we're taking all 5 points in sacrifice. So we're sacrificing 15% of our life, and then we're trimming that down by 60% because of this conviction node right here. But because we are hurting ourselves when we're casting Smite for single target damage and for mana sustain, we want to have a little bit of leech, a little bit of vitality, a little bit of life gained on Smite use, and all of that makes it very comfortable overall. We have our resistance, vitality, we have armor and minus damage or reduced damage taken from nearby enemies, along with this mandatory node, mana gain and life gain whenever we use Smite directly, which we are because we're not triggering it, we're just casting it. In addition to that, we have our Void Knight tree. We have a bunch of things that say life, maybe health, maybe some attunement, some percent increased damage, and then anything that says plus flat damage. We're going to prioritize that, and I'll show you why in a moment here. So we've got health from Abyssal Endurance, flat damage, a little bit of leech as well to make sure that we can, map and do our echoes nice and smoothly. Umbral Attunement is not great, but Attunement does give 4% increased damage. So this is, what, 8% increased damage per point. It's not great, but we need something to get us across the hump of these middle nodes here, because none of these middle nodes is spectacular for us. Moving on from there, we have Eternal Form, which is Vitality and Life. So it's 15 flat health per point, which is quite good. Then we have Echo Chance, some percent increased damage with movement speed. So we actually go nice and fast with this build, which is really convenient. Plus Echo Chance here. So there's a 35%, 10, 20, 30. I think it's a 30% chance. 35% total chance for us to have our spell echoed, which is quite good. And then we're not taking Time Legion. I don't think these points are worth it for us because we're not using melee, we're not using Time Round. We just want the Echo Chance, and 1 point for Echo Chance I don't think is quite good enough. So that's just these good nodes here, and then we'll spend the rest of our points somewhere else. This node is not great, but it does enough. It's a unique effect. It shifts all enemies nearby forward for 4 seconds. So it's kind of like another layer of defense. And just for 1 point, I think it's relatively good. Earlier on, we were speccing into Future Mind as well. Future Mind is life and attunement. It's good, not great. But we recently changed the Future Mind node, and we started picking up some points in the Paladin tree. And the reason for that is, well, these first couple nodes, they have resistance on them. They're good, not great, but it makes our gearing a little bit easier so we can get different suffixes on our gear. Maybe instead of life, or maybe instead of health and resistance, we can get health and percent armor, or maybe health and crit avoidance. And it makes it easier for us to grab one piece of gear or swap out a different gear, stuff like that. And the real appeal is that these next 2 nodes here, Valor, which we're currently at 5 out of 8, and Flash of Brilliance, which we're only at 1 out of 8, these give us access to some pretty good health nodes. So Flash of Brilliance is 15 health per point. Remember, Vitality, 1 point of Vitality is 10 life. So this is a little bit better than Vitality, and it also has Blind Chance, a good layer of defense baked into it. I think if we hadn't figured out what to put our points in here, we kind of run out of points of things that we want to spec into. But I think these core points that we have into the Void Knight tree right now, I'm very happy with. And then beyond, like, what level are we? We're currently level 84. Beyond that, we don't really have too many things to spec into. So just a little bit of attunement, percent increased damage, maybe some extra leech, maybe some damage on increased damage on kill recently, maybe some fluff nodes. We'll pick them up after that. So that about does it for the masteries. Let's talk about the skills real quick. So I said that our 2 skills we use primarily for clear are Abyssal Echoes and Devouring Orb. For single target and for mana sustain, we have Smite. For movement, we have Lunge. And then for like juiced up single target damage, in case we really want the buff or the survivability, safety from it, we have Anomaly. So I think Anomaly is like the thing that you could drop out of the build if you didn't want to use it. You could try using something like Shield Rush instead, which could be spec'd to work with a 2-handed weapon. So you could Shield Rush there. Realistically, I don't think there's much else that you'd want to use other than maybe Volatile Reversal. But I think it's just about the best thing that you can do. And I'll show you why in a moment here. It's going to have to do with this node here, but we're going to start at the beginning. So Abyssal Echoes. This is the biggest chunk of our damage, and it has an enormous mana cost. Something that I thought that was really interesting about this build from the very beginning was that a lot of our nodes on Devouring Orb and Abyssal Echoes, they don't really have like increased damage, multiplicative damage, more damage here, more damage there. We don't really have many nodes that say more damage. These skills have a ton of damage baked into them. And the nodes that we're speccing into on our specialization have quality of life, echoes, duration, larger AoE, reduced mana cost, reduced mana cost, reduced mana cost. Oh my god, reduced mana cost, because these things cost a lot of mana. Let's run through this real quick. Our first nodes here, we're moving down to the bottom right side here. This Abyssal Echoes has cast speed and costs less mana, just 2 points. And then we have 1 extra echo, and then 4 extra echoes beyond that. And then the number of points that you spec into this, it could be 3, it could be 4, it could be 5 if you wanted. But I think 4 is a nice sweet spot for me. But this is definitely the one that you'll have to figure out where you want it exactly. So this is a big chunk of mana efficiency, but it also puts a larger delay between each recast of your Abyssal Echoes. So remember, Abyssal Echo looks like this, and then that's the delay that I'm talking about right there. So I like having 4 points in here, but you can play with this. Maybe 3 or 4 or 5 could be a good place to be. But remember, this is kind of like making your spell last longer so that you don't need to click it as often. So you can kind of think about it like that. We need to do a little bit of awkward pathing. We path through Abyssal Infusion, which we don't use in any way. This is Void Penetration for melee attacks. But the reason we have to spend 2 points pathing here is that we do not want Final Echo. Final Echo says that it no longer chains, and chaining is the fun part. So instead of not having fun, we're going to opt to instead have fun. So this is a 160% increased area of effect. This is awesome. We could go all 5 points here, but I feel like I already have enough AoE. So instead of having this 5th point here, I've opted into putting the 3rd point into Temporal Weaving. So Temporal Weaving is enemies take 30% increased damage. Pretty good overall. If I had 21, 22, 23 points, if I had some extra points in here, I would look into Abyssal Form or maybe Void Alacrity. This is something that I might investigate, or just filling out some extra area of effect over here. Temporal Blight is something we talked about in case you go over 20, in case you get plus levels. You could get this, have some extra debuffs that reduce attack, cast, movement speed. This is a possibility as well. But this core tree, I like this a lot, and I'm happy with it. Next up, I'm going to skip to Devouring Orb. Devouring Orb is like the other piece of the puzzle that really makes the build work. The most important thing for us is 2 pieces. We need this node down here, which is Devouring Orb has hit damage, but it costs more mana. So we need to take this. Normally, Devouring Orb, it doesn't do damage by itself, but it causes enemies to, it causes a explosion of damage, right? It says, creates an orb at the target location that casts a Void Rift whenever something nearby dies. So it doesn't actually have hit damage, it just causes a Void Rift to happen when something dies. So we need to make sure that it does damage, and then we also need to make sure that it has these Abyssal Orbs that cast as well. So the first thing, we want Cosmic Impact to make sure that we're actually hitting stuff and dealing damage. And the second thing is we want as many points into Dark Torrent as possible. So the Abyssal Orbs, they look like this. When I'm casting this, you'll see that the Devouring Orbs are the orbs that are circling around me, and all the orbs that are falling on the ground behind me, those are the Abyssal Orbs. And those, if you're familiar with Path of Exile, they kind of feel like Volatile Dead, because they do seek out and destroy things. The reason that we are prioritizing hitting stuff, because we need this to hit, and we need to have as many Abyssal Orbs as possible, and we have the increased Abyssal Orb creation frequency. The reason we need to hit things is, again, back to Abyssal Echoes. Abyssal Echoes says a Nova that echoes enemies, it applies a debuff called Abyssal Decay. Abyssal Decay is void damage over 6 seconds. If the enemy takes a hit, all that damage is dealt immediately to the enemy. So we need to hit the enemy somehow. And this is our preferred method of hitting things. It scales well with void damage. It's very easy to cast. It has huge coverage on it. It's basically automatic. This is an excellent spell for us. Let's go on to Smite next. Smite's what we're using for single target damage. There's 2 important nodes here. The first one is Righteous Flurry on the top left. This is increased attack and cast speed if you hit an enemy with Smite recently. So this is 50% increased cast speed. So this makes it so that we can do our single target damage nice and smoothly. So we have tons of cast speed baked into this. We don't really need it on any other piece of gear. Maybe a prefix on a pair of gloves if we have the extra slot for it. The next important node would be Sacrifice. Because we're self-casting, we can afford to spend all 5 points in Sacrifice, along with 3 points in Conviction. We have 20 points here, and it doesn't really matter to go to 21, 22, or 23, because there's not much else on the tree that we'd rather grab instead. I have my 19th and 20th point spec'd into Crit Multi, because there's nothing else on the tree that I really want. You could also spec 2 points into Blinding Flash to have a chance to blind, and maybe you grab the extra like Lightning Zap nodes up here if you have 21, 22, or 23, but I don't think that's particularly worthwhile. I think just leaving this where it is and not prioritizing getting 21, 22 plus levels of Smite, I don't think it really does much for it. And I'm happy just getting my 5 points into Righteous Flurry, my 5 points here, and my 3 points into Conviction to make it so that it doesn't quite hurt as much. Next thing, this is the 4th spell we're talking about, is Lunge. I feel like all the Lunge characters that I play kind of look the same. If you're crit, you might end up taking this node, Avenger's Charge, to give you 40% increased crit chance per point in here. This is pretty good. But outside of this, I think the base of all of my Lunge trees kind of look the same. My 18, 19, and 20th point have gone into Overwhelm so that I have a stun chance. But other than that, we're just happy enough to have +1 Lunge, invulnerable or invincible while lunging, then a little bit of like life gain on hit, a little bit of an increased area of effect to make sure that we're hitting more stuff so that we can gain more life here. Some mana efficiency, some armor and stun avoidance. I'm happy enough to have this, but the last thing here, this is kind of fluff. We could respec Anomaly into something else, but I think it's good enough, and it's a good role player here for single target damage. It's worth noting that currently Anomaly is bugged. If you take immediacy along with the time lock, it will immediately lock enemies in place. So instead of sending them forward in time and then waiting for them to come back, what it'll do is it immediately locks the enemy in place. The reason this is bugged is that it works on bosses. If you hold down Alt, it says it does not affect bosses, but don't tell EHG that. So currently this works on bosses. It'll be patched at some point in the future, hopefully, but just for us right now, the reason that we're using this, and even if it weren't bugged, we would still be using this, is for this node down here. So we go all the way to this. When enemies return to the present, they take increased void damage for a duration. So this is 100% increased void damage taken, which along with Abyssal Echo, which is 30% increased damage taken. And then with this node here, which says slowing enemies and causing them to take increased void damage, we have a lot of enemies take increased damage, which is a great way of scaling our damage. This build has a lot of damage baked into it, and there's one key thing that I need to point out for how we're scaling our damage. Because Abyssal Echoes has damage over 6 seconds, and then if you hit the enemy, all that damage gets compressed and dealt immediately. If we scale duration, that means that we are making that 6 seconds last longer, which is kind of like adding base damage, and then we can deal that damage immediately. So we have access to cool nodes like this, or cool lines of text like this. This says 34% increased Abyssal Decay duration. Along with this, we have on the helmet as well. This is a tier 2 modifier, unfortunately, but it's still 19% increased Abyssal Decay duration. You can get these on idols as well. It's like 8 to 10 or 4 to 10 Abyssal Decay duration. On the idols, it's not quite as good. You'd rather have idols that just say % increased void damage because that's a better use of your idol slots. But having it on your chest piece, this Abyssal Decay duration, is quite good because the numbers for like a tier 5 mod on your chest piece, they go pretty high. And that's kind of like scaling your 6 seconds to maybe 6.5 or maybe 7 seconds. And that's kind of like adding base damage, which is a cool and interesting way of scaling your damage in this build. The other interesting thing to point out here, which you might do immediately, because I would recommend it, is holding down Alt over your normal skill. So whatever your skill is, whether you're playing this build or some other build, you need to hit Alt. You need to see exactly how you're scaling damage and whether there's like some helper text that helps you understand exactly what's going on. So Abyssal Decay, you can see on the screen here, Abyssal Decay deals a total of 60 void damage during its duration with added spell effectiveness of 300%. So we have 300% effectiveness of added damage, which is huge. It's really, really big. Which tells us that we probably want to consider using a staff, and as it turns out, we are considering using a staff. So this is the best possible staff base for us. We want to use an Oracle staff. So this is 99 or 81 to 100. So we have a 99 roll on the adaptive spell damage on the implicit there. And the prefixes, they're not too spicy, but just something like increased spell damage, increased void damage. You could go increased damage over time as well, because damage over time would scale our Abyssal Echoes. But opting into spell damage and void damage means that incidentally, we're also scaling some of the damage from our Devouring Orb, which is, remember, happening all the time. It's hitting a lot of enemies. So let's talk real briefly about the rest of our gear. We have mana gain on Smite use. We talked about this already. Abyssal Decay duration is a nice way of scaling things. Things like void damage, damage over time, spell damage would all be good. Void penetration would be an excellent modifier to have as a prefix on your gear as well. I can show you my my rings, amulet, and belt first because the prefixes are not very good at all. But you'd like all these prefixes to either be vitality, or maybe on your amulet, void penetration, or just % increased damage, % increased damage, % increased damage. For your suffixes, you're looking for things like whatever res you need to kind of fill those things out. Maybe health or hybrid health, along with crit avoidance wherever possible. So we are over 100, we're at 103 crit avoid, excellent. For our gloves, we're looking for a little bit of cast speed, maybe a cast speed base, or maybe just a cast speed prefix. Just a little tiny bit is going to make the build feel just fine. For our boots, vitality, movement speed, health, % health, crit avoid, resistance, whatever it is that's going to help get your resistances fixed up is excellent. For our relic here, our relic is not good. Remember, we only just made it to our empowered monoliths. But again, you're looking for % damage, life, res. So just like void and damage over time would be our two prefixes. And then for our suffixes, maybe just a health, maybe crit avoid, maybe res, whatever that's going to help fill in the rest of your character. Idols are primarily just like high rolls of % increased damage over time. Unfortunately, Abyssal Decay duration doesn't roll high enough, so it's fine, it's okay, but you'd really just rather have as much void damage over time rolls as possible. Yeah, this character's been good fun. Happy to keep playing it. We're going to do a couple echoes here. I'm enjoying the character enough. I kind of want to farm some blessings to make sure that we're actually getting everything we want. Fortunately enough, during our first run through of the monoliths, we already have chance to shred Void Res on hit, which is sweet, even though we got the lowest possible roll. But maybe we can farm up maybe a better one of those, maybe some extra like chance to avoid crits, or maybe some extra resistance somewhere to make the rest of our gearing process even easier. But I mean, listen, now that we're in empowered monoliths, this is the fun part. So it's been a good time so far. We're gonna keep it up, and yeah, be a fun character.